Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's a particular personal pleasure for me tonight to welcome Susan Rice, who's going to speak to us about U.S. policy in Africa, a partnership for the 21st century. She'll be introduced by Jendai Fraser, but I just wanted to say a personal word of welcome to Susan. I had the pleasure of working with Susan, who is now in the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, but when I knew her, she was handling the same account in the National Security Council. And I must say she was one of the most effective young not civil servants, a political appointee, but the effective young government officials that I have seen in 2 tours of work in the federal government. And I was interested to run into my friend and colleague John Deutsch tonight, who said, "Wasn't she great?" And the answer is, she still is. So Susan, it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. And let me turn to Jendai Fraser to make your official introduction. Jendai is an assistant professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School, also an expert on international security and political development in Africa, writing a book on civilian control of the military in Africa, and about to take a 1-year leave from the Kennedy School to go work on African issues on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Jendai.
Good evening. You all look really good. It's good to see you all this afternoon or this evening. I'm especially happy we could bring the Assistant Secretary here since we are at a turning point in African history and U.S.-Africa relations. And this sea change has been noted by many. For example, Thabo Mbeki has coined the term an African Renaissance to describe this point in history. And Susan Rice began speaking of a new generation of African leaders on the eve of her trip to Africa with Secretary Albright in December of '97. And the administration is also crafting its policy of a partnership for the 21st century. However, as we all know, historical turning points are always driven by human agency. And to some extent, this period is launched by, and we have witnessed the best of such moments and of such agency with the move to majority rule in South Africa. And although not yet consolidated, South Africa's transition to majority rule brings to a close a sad chapter in Africa's history, namely the period beginning with slavery and colonial rule. So the question now is, what can we and what can our new Assistant Secretary do to build or grasp and consolidate this moment in order to create a better and brighter future? I have every confidence in Assistant Secretary based on her past record and broad experience in government service, the private sector, and community service in the nonprofit sector. The Honorable Dr. Susan Rice was confirmed as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs in October 1997. Before joining the State Department, she served from '95 to '97 at the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs. Also at the National Security Council, she was Director for International Organizations and Peacekeeping in the Office of Global Issues and Multilateral Affairs. In the private sector, she was a management consultant for Toronto's McKinsey & Company, where she assisted multinational corporations with a broad range of strategic, operational, and organizational problems. Her community service includes work as a legal assistant for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1986, as a legal advocate for the Mid-Peninsula Support Network for Battered Women in '83 and '84, and as a co-founder and director of the Free South Africa Fund at Stanford University. This fund was an alternative alumni endowment fund, which was part of the divestment campaign, which contributed to South Africa's international isolation. My path first crossed with Susan during her days as a student. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in 1986 from our alma mater, Stanford University, absolutely, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa with department honors and university distinction. In 1988, she received her MPhil at New College at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and it's perhaps fitting that she was a Rhodes Scholar and then chose to write her thesis on Zimbabwe, particularly examining the critical role played by the Commonwealth Observer Group in a monitoring force in 79-80, which created the favorable conditions for a ceasefire and the establishment of Zimbabwe's national army. She went on to receive her DPhil, or PhD, in 1990 at Oxford in International Relations, and her dissertation won the Chatham House British International Studies Association Prize for the most distinguished doctoral dissertation in the United Kingdom in the field of international relations, which was quite an honor. I want to conclude by telling just a brief story that I think, or I believe, speaks to the character of our speaker this evening. And I don't know if she remembers this. But in 1990, when I was in London and at Oxford doing research myself on armed struggle in Kenya and in Zimbabwe, Susan invited me over for lunch at her house. And after we had a wonderful lunch, much to my surprise, she pulled out her address book, and she proceeded to give me detailed biographies of the key political players in Zimbabwe and their addresses and their phone numbers. These were people who she had recently interviewed. And for me, this was my first encounter with an unselfish sharing of prime research contacts. I mean, the absolute top leaders in Zimbabwe. And I, for one, will always remember Susan for this unsolicited demonstration of collegiality and scholarly cooperation. So I just want to say thank you very much for that. I'll never forget it. Yeah, it set a standard for me. And so please join me in welcoming our new Assistant Secretary, Dr. Susan Rice.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jendai, for that very warm introduction. Thank you, Dr. Nye, for your warm welcome and thoughts. It really is a pleasure to be here with all of you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics, as well as the Women in Public Policy program for hosting this event and for hosting that very lovely reception that we all enjoyed. And I'd also like to thank the many student and community organizations who played an important role in making this evening possible. I'd like to welcome all of you, Harvard students, faculty, community leaders, and others who've taken time to be with us tonight. The Kennedy School has a long tradition of producing some of our nation's most talented leaders and public servants. And although, as Jendai said, I'm a mere Stanford alumni, I'm very honored to be with you here in this very esteemed hall tonight. You invited me here to talk about the Clinton administration's policy towards Africa. Let me begin by stating what I hope is increasingly obvious. These are quite exciting times to be working on Africa. As President Clinton so aptly said in Independence Square in Ghana, old patterns are fading away. Nations and individuals finally are free to seek a newer world where democracy and peace and prosperity are not slogans, but the essence of a new Africa. Africa, as Jendai said, is experiencing a renaissance. 10 short years ago, apartheid reigned in South Africa. The number of functioning democracies could be counted on the fingers of one hand. And economic growth in many African countries was measured in negative figures. Today, over half of the 48 countries of sub-Saharan Africa enjoy some form of democratic government. In many countries, from Namibia to Mali, reconciliation has supplanted confrontation as the means of bridging differences rooted in the past. There's now hope for lasting peace in Mozambique and the Horn of Africa, in Liberia and Angola. As important, African citizens are insisting that they be involved in decisions that affect their lives. Increasingly, they are demanding just and accountable leadership. And from Cape Town to Kampala, from Dar es Salaam to Dakar, growing economies are fueling this transformation. 2/3 of African nations are implementing reforms to open their markets, privatize industry, stabilize currencies, and reduce inflation. Economic growth on the continent has averaged almost 5% in recent years, and in a number of countries has almost reached 10%. By the end of 1995, African nations had privatized over 2,000 state enterprises, raising $2.3 billion in government revenue to invest in building infrastructure, lowering infant mortality rates, and boosting literacy. As a result of this progress, U.S. trade and investment in Africa is also rising. Our exports to Africa now exceed those to all of the former Soviet Union combined by more than 1/3. An average return on book value of U.S. investment in Africa is nearly 3 times higher than the global average. Just 1 month ago, President Clinton completed an historic 11-day trip to the African continent. He was the first sitting president ever to undertake a comprehensive trip to Africa, and I was privileged to join him in each of his stops in Ghana, Uganda, Rwanda, South Africa, Botswana, and Senegal. In a spirit befitting the dramatic political and economic reforms underway in Africa, during his visit, the President and his African partners agreed to recast our relationship. They pledged an active and mature partnership for the 21st century based on mutual interest and mutual respect. The Clinton administration has numerous achievements to build on as we approach this decisive new phase in U.S. relations with Africa. And I'd like to mention just a few of those milestones. First, the Clinton administration played an important role in the final dismantling of apartheid in 1994. We provided substantial assistance, more than any other bilateral donor, over $600 million in the first 3 years, to the newly elected democratic government in South Africa. In 1994, the President hosted the first ever White House Conference on Africa, which brought together key U.S. policymakers, private sector representatives, and other American leaders to discuss the future of Africa. In 1994, the administration also played an important role in bringing to fruition the peace process in Mozambique, which culminated in democratic elections. In 1995, the Clinton administration inaugurated the U.S.-South Africa Binational Commission to promote cooperation in trade, development, environmental, and security matters. And last June, the President unveiled his Partnership for Economic Growth and Opportunity in Africa, a sweeping new initiative designed to expand trade and investment between Africa and the United States. Last December's visit to Africa by Secretary Albright underscored our commitment to promoting conflict resolution, democracy, and respect for human rights. And most recently, the President's historic trip has further strengthened and deepened our ties to the African continent. 2 principal objectives underlay the President's mission to Africa. The first was changing American perceptions of Africa, and the second was forging a new relationship with the continent for the 21st century. As President Clinton stated again to the people of Ghana, it's time for Americans to put a new Africa on our maps. The President thus engaged Africans from all walks of life, not just government leaders, but entrepreneurs, environmentalists, village leaders, teachers, and students. In doing so, he helped to refocus the lens through which Americans view Africa, to see beyond the distorted images of war, famine, and disease. For the first time, Americans began to see Africa from a panoramic, broad view: vast and diverse societies, modern cities, sometimes with impressive skylines, small villages, universities, factories, micro-enterprises, and regular people with aspirations just the same as our own. In Uganda, for example, the President met with resourceful village women, forging micro-businesses to create wealth and improve living standards at the grassroots level. In South Africa, the President and the First Lady went to Guguletu Township outside of Cape Town to join with enterprising women who were laying bricks to build new homes for their families. In Dakar, Senegal, the President met with democracy and human rights advocates from all over the continent to underscore the United States' commitment to good governance, strong civic institutions, and respect for human rights. and in a small village called Dal Jiam, also in Senegal, the President met a community that came together to revitalize their village, which had been shrinking, by starting new small businesses and creating jobs with assistance from USAID and the National Council for Negro Women. These are not the stereotypical images of famine, disease, and conflict that the world has become used to seeing from Africa. They're images of a new generation of Africans embracing a dynamic new future. They are images of hope, renewal, and possibility. And for the first time, they were being transmitted around the world by our print and broadcast media. Still, President Clinton was intent on much more than simply changing American perceptions of Africa, as important as that may be. He set out also to build on the achievements of his administration and to advance our two overarching policy goals in Africa. The first of these policy goals is to accelerate Africa's full integration into the global economy. As the global village shrinks and nations forge closer economic ties, Africa must not be left behind. Increasing its trade and commercial links with the rest of the world is crucial to the sustainable economic growth and development that Africa needs to alleviate endemic poverty. And success in this regard will render Africans and Americans safer and more prosperous. As extreme poverty is checked in Africa and the social unrest which often accompanies it subsides, the need for costly intervention by the international community will also diminish. At the same time, Americans will reap the benefits of increased trade and investment in Africa. Currently, 100,000 American jobs depend on exports to Africa. And as the huge, mostly untapped African market of now some 700 million people grows and our market share increases, thousands of new American jobs will be created. To achieve the goal of integrating Africa into the global economy, the United States has been actively working to ensure progress in three key interrelated areas. The first is promoting sustainable economic growth and development. The second is promoting democracy and respect for human rights, which foster the social conditions necessary for growth. And the third is preventing and resolving conflicts, since peace and stability are basic prerequisites for democracy and development. During his Africa trip, the President announced a series of new initiatives aimed at reinforcing progress in each of these three areas. To advance sustainable economic growth and development, the President pledged to work with Congress to pass the landmark African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is now passed the House of Representatives, is now pending before the Senate. He also committed to work with Congress to restore U.S. assistance levels to Africa to their historic highs, to help make sustainable Africa's transition from aid to trade in the 21st century. And to make this new trade-based relationship a reality, the President will implement his Partnership for Economic Growth and Opportunity. This plan will accelerate Africa's integration into the global economy by encouraging necessary economic reforms and stimulating trade and investment. To help alleviate Africa's crushing debt burden, the President is asking Congress for funds sufficient to eliminate the $1.6 billion in bilateral concessional debt owed to the United States by Africa's reforming countries. And he pledged to raise with his G7 partners later this month in Birmingham the pressing concerns he heard from African leaders regarding multilateral debt relief initiatives. To spur regional economic integration, the President announced a new $500 million infrastructure investment fund through the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC. This fund will also assist microenterprises and women-owned businesses. While in Johannesburg, the President dedicated the Commerce Department's Ron Brown Commercial Center and promised to endow a new institute in Secretary Brown's name. This institute will help young African entrepreneurs acquire the business skills necessary to compete in the global economy in the century to come. Finally, to ensure swift follow-up in all of these areas, the U.S. will invite African trade, finance, and foreign ministers to meet with their American partners every year from this year forth to advance the cause of political and economic reform in Africa. And the President will also welcome leaders of reforming African nations to a summit meeting in Washington to continue the dialogue begun in Africa. Just 2 weeks after the President returned from Africa, the chairman of the Export-Import Bank, James Harmon, left on an unprecedented trip to Africa to demonstrate that the United States truly means business. And later this year, the Secretaries of Commerce, Treasury, Defense, and Transportation will each undertake missions to Africa to follow up on the progress the President made. To advance democracy and promote respect for human rights, the President announced in Uganda a new $120 million Education for Development and Democracy initiative, which will improve the quality of African education at all levels, but will focus in particular on girls' education. By promoting African access to information and technology needed to compete in the 21st century, it will facilitate economic development as well as bolster civic education and strengthen democratic values. Specifically through community-based resource centers, school-to-school partnerships, and stronger U.S.-African professional and civic networks, we hope to help Africans move from chalkboards to keyboards, from schoolrooms to university classrooms, and on to boardrooms in the century to come. In Botswana, the President announced the establishment of a new broadcasting service called Radio Democracy for Africa. As a division of the Voice of America, it will train African journalists and broadcast programs focused primarily on bolstering democracy, respect for human rights, and humanitarian principles throughout Africa. And at the Entebbe Summit of Regional Leaders, the President endorsed a historic communique committing the signatories to protecting human rights, strengthening democracy, and nurturing civil society. And we will hold our African partners to those commitments. To prevent and resolve conflicts, the President reviewed a Senegalese-American peacekeeping training exercise and affirmed the United States' commitment to implement fully the African Crisis Response Initiative. This innovative training program, which was in fact the brainchild of Dr. Nye many years back, is aimed at building African capacity to respond rapidly and effectively to peacekeeping and humanitarian challenges. At the same time in Senegal, the President announced his intention to establish an African Center for Security Studies, modeled after the Marshall Center in Germany. This African Center will provide a forum for senior military and civilian leaders to explore together complex defense policy issues and provide training to strengthen civil-military relationships in burgeoning democracies. And finally, in Rwanda, the President called on the community of nations to strengthen our ability to prevent and, if necessary, to stop genocide. The President committed the United States to work with nations in the region to create an international coalition against genocide and pledged support to the Rwandan Genocide Survivors Fund and to civil society organizations in that country. As peaceful, democratic, and prosperous countries emerge throughout Africa, the United States will be better positioned to advance our second principal policy objective in Africa. That is to protect the United States and its citizens against threats to our national security that emanate from Africa, just as they do from everywhere else in the world. In addition to weapons proliferation, we must continue to guard against state-sponsored terrorism, narcotic flows, the growing influence of rogue states, international crime, environmental degradation, and disease. To this end, the President announced several other important initiatives in Africa. A new Safe Skies for Africa initiative will help African states improve their air navigation services, aviation safety, and airport security, essential steps in combating terrorism, narcotics, and crime. And the President also pledged to work for swift passage by the Senate of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, a pressing problem for many communities throughout Africa. And he also committed $16 million this year to fight infectious diseases in Africa, including AIDS and malaria. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're still awake, I don't need to tell you that that is a very ambitious agenda. Its implementation will require congressional support and vigorous follow-up. This administration is committed, and I am personally committed, to seeing the promise of the President's trip fulfilled in tangible ways for years to come. When President Clinton traveled to Africa, he was not only extending the hand of partnership to a new generation of Africans, he was affirming Africa's great promise. Realizing this promise will benefit Africans and Americans alike. As Africa prospers, new markets will open for American goods and services, creating thousands of new American jobs. As democracy and strong civic and educational institutions take root throughout the continent, the security of our own political system will be enhanced by forging links with partners who share our values. And as conflict is checked and peace spreads, we will find more stable and reliable allies in combating transnational security threats. Yet for all of its promise, Africa is plainly not free from peril. The potential for renewed genocide in Central Africa, the recent civil wars in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and both Congos, pariah states that export terror, and military dictatorships from Nigeria to Sudan all threaten to reverse the fragile progress Africans have made. Thus, we must be energetic and ambitious in working together with African partners to build democracy, respect for human rights, and to resolve remaining conflicts. All of us in this room have an important role to play. Let me end with a short story about a good and faithful man who came upon hard times. Every time he turned around, it seemed that another demand was placed on him, and he kept going deeper and deeper into debt. Finally, one night in his distress, he dropped to his knees, clenched his hands, and raised his head up to the sky and said, "Dear Lord, I'm in trouble. Please let me win the lottery, and soon." The next week, he was optimistic that his condition would change. But after 3 months with no results, his faith began to waver. And by the end of the year, he was just downright mad. He said, "Are you there, God? I believed you would help me. I prayed you would help me, and I have heard nothing." And suddenly, a dark cloud appeared in the sky, lightning flashed, and a voice boomed. "Yeah, all right already. I heard you. I hear you. I heard you the first time. I heard you the second time. I've heard your every prayer. But the least you can do is buy a lottery ticket." The bottom line is we all have to do our own little part. None of us can afford to be bystanders at this pivotal point in history. As John F. Kennedy said, there are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range risks and costs of comfortable inaction. Today, many African people can dare hope that their children will achieve decent standards of living, study and work in peace and security, freely select leaders who will govern responsibly and respect human rights. If Africa can achieve liftoff, then we all, Africans and Americans, stand to benefit. And if Africa fails, we will all pay the price. In the aftermath of President Clinton's historic trip to Africa, I look forward to working with all of you to make certain that the United States is an active and constructive partner as Africans strive to secure a better future. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take about 15 minutes of questions because we have to get Susan to the airport because her flight leaves at 8, so she has to be on that plane. If you could go to the mics to ask your question and give your name and affiliation when you do, and please be sure to ask a question and make it brief so that we can get as many in as we can, and we'll start at this mic here.
Hi, I'm Nita Crawford. I teach at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and my question is about U.S. policy toward Nigeria, and in particular, if you could say what the administration and what your thoughts are about sanctions for Nigeria.
Well, let me start by explaining what we hope for in Nigeria. Nigeria is obviously Africa's most populous and arguably its most important country, and its record in recent years has been abysmal. We would like to see a Nigeria that's stable, that's prosperous, that's democratic, and respects human rights, so that Nigeria can play its rightful role not only in Africa, but in the world more broadly. For those of you that have been following recent events in Nigeria, you know that things are moving in precisely the wrong direction. General Abacha's transition program was dubious to begin with, but in recent weeks has proved to be gravely flawed and failing. And that's a source of great concern to us in Washington, not least because we fear it could lead to the sort of political tension and instability that could be devastating for the entire region. We are in the process of talking to partners in Africa and elsewhere in Europe and beyond about what steps the international community ought to take in response to various outcomes in Nigeria. Sanctions have always been an option. They remain an option. But the United States' position has been to seek a multilateral consensus for sanctions, at least the broadest form of collective action possible. We recognize that it may not be through the United Nations Security Council, but there are other means of achieving collective action if that proves to be necessary. Okay, right here. I'm going to go back and forth. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. My name is Fred Kwaba. I am from Kenya, but I live here in the U.S., particularly here in Massachusetts. You touched on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. I want to return to that because a lot of us have criticized that act. And here's what is bad about it. That act requires that any African nation that engages in serious human rights violations or trades with a country that engages in serious human rights violations will have no contracts with the U.S. Now, even Mandela has criticized that because this country itself is engaging in trade with China, but it's not allowing other countries to do it. I mean, South Africa would love to engage in trade with Libya, with Cuba. Those are friends that have supported that country for a long time. So why this double standard? Can you speak to that, please?
Yes, I very much appreciate your question and the opportunity to address the issue. There are some very serious and, I gather, widespread misunderstandings about what's in that bill. And I urge you all to read it very carefully because there is absolutely nothing in that bill that says that if you trade with countries, if you're an African country that trades with countries that violate human rights, then you're not eligible for the benefits in the bill. That's just not in there. What the legislation does do is provide a great deal of additional access to the United States market for countries that are in the process of implementing important economic reforms. It's important to realize that the President's economic initiative, which is already in the process of being implemented, provides important benefits for all African countries, new benefits that go beyond existing development assistance. But additional to those new benefits in the legislation are new incentives and new opportunities for countries that are engaged in economic reform. There is a provision in the legislation that says if your country is a gross violator of human rights, and those are the words in the bill, then you would not be eligible for these additional new benefits under the legislation. That's standard language in most of our legislation that, or law that provides either assistance or enhanced market access. And I think it's very hard to argue with the validity of that sort of provision. We certainly support it.
Are there mics upstairs? Okay, here.
Good afternoon. My name is Kia Coleman, and I'm a first-year master's degree student here. My question is, can you talk a little bit more about what the U.S. plans and the international community plan in terms of integrating programs that will help nations respond quicker to genocide and other threats to peacekeeping, and how the U.S. can reconcile some of the African leaders' concerns for their own country's sovereignty?
Well, let me begin by saying that it was the experience of the Rwandan genocide in 1994 and the failure of the United States and the rest of the international community and the states in the region to respond in a timely and effective fashion that led to the idea of creating an African Crisis Response Initiative. This is an effort at building African capacity to respond quickly to peacekeeping and humanitarian challenges, and that's going very well. We are in the process of training now 7 African nations at the battalion level and building up to the brigade and the division level so that they can work together in a quick fashion should a crisis arise. Our goal is to train 10,000 to 12,000 African troops so that there is a residual capacity that can be available at the call of the United Nations or the OAU in the event of a crisis. But the reality is that that initiative will take at least perhaps another 3 years before it comes to fruition. And so the challenge is to find ways and means in the interim to be in a position to respond to a crisis should it occur. And what the President committed to do in Entebbe is to work with the countries in the region, in the first instance, on ways to prevent genocide. And they agreed to a variety of things, ranging from reactivating the United Nations Arms Flow Commission, which is set up to monitor arms flows into the region, as well as to empower the regional leaders to intervene diplomatically in a preventive capacity. But they're also in the process of discussing humanitarian intervention options that might be available more quickly than the African Crisis Response Initiative. You asked a question about the sovereignty of African nations, or nations in general. The African countries themselves, through the OAU and through other mechanisms, have invited the international community to help build this sort of capacity. And I think everybody at this stage is more interested in building that capacity and having it available at the call of a legitimate international organization, more concerned about that than the alternative, which is to say everybody's sovereign and therefore nobody's responsible, which has been a mistake of the past.
Hi, my name is Patrick Sylvain from the Ed School. If the U.S. is truly committed to development, beside having a 700 million people where you have a virgin market to exploit and so forth, there's 1.9 billion collateral debt. Not sure what the exact number is for the multilateral debt. In the late 1800s, Africa was a magnificent cake, divided, we know the story, by the powers. Has anyone mentioned the complete elimination of all the debts as a moral commitment to the fact that of slavery and the raping of Africa? If you're really serious about seeing the development of the entire continent.
Well, there's several answers to your question. The first answer is to repeat something that I said in my prepared remarks, which is to underscore that the United States understands the importance of working to help alleviate the debt burden. And for that reason, we have asked Congress for additional money to relieve the vast majority of the bilateral debt owed to the United States by reforming African countries, as well as to work, to continue to work, I should say, through the G7 and other venues to deal with the multilateral debt issue. The United States was a leader in putting together what is called the HIPC initiative, which sounds like bad cough medicine, but what it really is the highly indebted poorest country initiative, which is aimed at providing enhanced debt relief to African countries that are pursuing economic reforms. The principle that underlies that initiative is one that we think is very important, because if the international community were, even if it could afford to, just wipe out all of the debt owed by African countries, what would be accomplished if there weren't the policy reforms in place to ensure that that debt would not be accumulated again in the future? And so the principle of providing maximal relief to those countries that are in the process of undertaking precisely the kind of reforms that will make their growth sustainable is a sound one. And we are working with others to make available the resources to help countries that fall into that category, and there are many. Uganda and Mozambique and Burkina Faso and others are on the way to receiving that kind of debt relief that will help make their development challenge more sustainable.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Bradley, a first-year student at the Kennedy School, master's student. I was wondering, as South Africa moves into its dismantling of apartheid, has the United States taken any action to ensure that the black South Africans move into positions of power, or at least training programs are set up in South Africa, or do you view that as something that should be left entirely up to the South African government?
Well, obviously, the South African government has to undertake the policy initiatives and decisions that will, in the long run, eradicate the vestiges of apartheid. But through the U.S.-South Africa Binational Commission, there are various ways that we are working to help make that transition somewhat easier, and in particular to build human capital in South Africa among black South Africans. And there are a range of programs that the United States is supporting, one of which is called the Mandela Scholars Program, which funds doctoral study for South African students who are going into economics and other forms of policy studies. So that is one way in which we're helping to build human capital, but there are many others, and we see that as sort of the fundamental challenge in South Africa. We can play a supportive role to the extent that the government would seek our support, but at the end of the day, obviously, the government itself and the broader society in South Africa will have to make the changes necessary.
Thank you.
We can take just two more questions because of time.
Okay. I'm Maureen Nidahen. I'm a registered pharmacist here in Boston. Permit me to express on behalf of my group, the Nigerian Advocacy Group for Democracy and Human Rights, Nigerian Pro-Democracy Group here in Boston, which I head, our appreciation for your well-articulated, principled, and consistent stance on General Abacha's transition shenanigans. We hope you received our official formal letter on this score. Well, in light of what you've expressed here today, can we assume then, due to Sani Abacha's lack of transparency in his transition program, can we assume two things here at this point, that the United States government will, come October 1st, 1998, make a public declaration not acknowledging Abacha as the president of Nigeria? Can we assume that? And secondly, the issue of oil embargo, is it seriously imminent at this point? And if so, if not, why not? And can we also assume, too, that these two issues, the lack of the oil embargo and the declaration from the United States not acknowledging Abacha, can we assume that those two issues will be tabled at a somewhat highly sensitive meeting between Madeleine Albright and Robin Cook, soon to be held in the future?
Boy, many questions in one answer.
Sorry, well,
one question. Let me try to answer your questions as candidly as possible. The United States has made plain, and I think will continue to make plain, that the transition process is gravely flawed and failing. And if at its conclusion it looks as flawed as it looks now, I think we will make very clear that we do not accept it as a legitimate expression of the will of the people of Nigeria. But if General Abacha is in power, it's a fact that he's in power. And there is a difference between what we say we think is right and what may be the fact. And so I say that to answer your first question. To your second question about an oil embargo, the United States has been very careful not to rule in or rule out any particular sanctions. But experience shows that for an oil embargo to be an effective mechanism, it needs to be universal. And that means it needs the support of the United Nations Security Council, and it ought to be enforced, and in some cases enforced with force. And I think the plain fact is that at least at present, there isn't the will in the United Nations Security Council and beyond to implement oil sanctions on Nigeria. That's not to say that things will not change. But I think if we're serious about an oil sanction, it needs to be multilateral and it needs to be enforced.
Okay, and then will this issue be tabled by Madeleine
Oh, well,
Albright?
let me just, sorry, I didn't mean to ignore your third question. I just got lost in the wilderness out there. Yes, Secretary Albright and Secretary Robin Cook have discussed Nigeria and will continue to discuss Nigeria. It is an issue that is of importance to us and importance to Britain, and it regularly gets discussed at high levels.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry for the people standing at the mic, but just one more question and very brief, please.
Okay, Maswela say, Bruce Thatcher, Expedition Airways, Harare, Zimbabwe. As the past operations director for Massport here at Logan Airport, the $1.2 million in the Safe Sky initiatives, I was with the administrator in California the week before last. Just please, for us over there in the aviation business, don't raise the Africans' hopes, because as I talked about the programs that money was going to flow in, it doesn't seem to be there. When Israel went up on the radar screen, they got $1 million the next day for security equipment. It takes 3 hours to fly north to south in the Democratic Republic of Congo. $1 million, we need your support and continued support to make sure that we make it safe for everybody on the continent.
First of all, that's this fiscal year,
yes,
and there will be more in years to come. But it's important to understand the nature of this program. What the United States is going to provide primarily in the first instance is technical assistance to help African transportation authorities determine what is necessary to upgrade their aviation security measures, their radar, and various safety and security infrastructure. What has proved the case in places around the world, and we're confident will prove the case in Africa, is that once those types of changes are made, and they're often made with the assistance of the private sector, that they become not only self-sustaining economically, but profitable in the medium to long term. And so what we can best provide is the technical knowledge and the seed capital which will help the African governments institute the kinds of reforms that are necessary to enable the private sector to come in and, for example, as you would well know, to run an effective aviation safety system in a particular country, which then would allow that country to make revenue from overflight clearances and all sorts of other means that are self-sustaining over the long term. We realize it's not a great deal of money. That obviously will not allow us to begin in every African country simultaneously, but we will work in a handful of countries in the first instance, and we hope to prove the success of this project and then replicate it elsewhere.
And thank you, and they're ready for you over there. I just brought 15 directors of civil aviation. We're waiting with our open arms. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you for... I was going to say join me in thanking Susan Rice, but you've already done it spontaneously. I'm very sorry for the people who are still at the mic, but we simply couldn't take any more questions. And just one more round of applause for her.
Thank you.
Good job, Susan. Keep up the good work. We'll welcome you back anytime.
Now, don't even try. The last time I talked to Carlos, I tell you what, did you tell me to get on Carlos too? Do you remember Carol Lover? Yeah, changing her hair. How are you? I haven't seen you for a year. Since the women's conference. I know. How are you doing? Tell me with all your training. I'm spending more time with you and are you traveling to all over the world? Yes, yes. That's doing very well. I'm doing the doing what I like and what I am very good at. I'm doing management training. Oh, yeah. Doing participatory training.